The alarm clock rang at 5:30 in the morning at Kensington Palace. William opened his eyes and took a deep breath. Today was the big day, the coronation of his father as king. He gently woke Kate, who was still sleeping next to him. "It's time," he said softly. Kate nodded and got up quickly. They had planned this day for months. Every detail mattered. The world would be watching them and their children. "I'll check on the kids," Kate said as she put on her robe. William walked to the window and looked outside. Even at this early hour, he could see people already lining up along the streets of London. Some had camped overnight to get the best spots to see the royal family. "What a day this will be," he whispered to himself. In the children's rooms, Kate found the royal nannies already helping George, Charlotte, and Louis get ready. George, now 9 years old, stood tall as a nanny helped him with his special outfit for the day. "Mum, will I have to walk by myself?" George asked, a hint of worry in his voice. "No, darling. You'll be with Dad and me. We'll all walk together," Kate assured him with a warm smile. Charlotte was sitting patiently while her hair was being brushed. At 7 years old, she already understood how important today was. "Mummy, my dress is so beautiful," she said, touching the delicate fabric. "Will I look like a proper princess?" "You always look like a princess because you are one," Kate said, kissing her forehead. Little Louis, just 5 years old, was the hardest to keep still. He jumped on his bed in his underwear while a nanny tried to catch him. "Louis, we need to get dressed now," Kate said, trying not to laugh at his energy. "But Mummy, I'm practicing my royal wave," Louis demonstrated with great enthusiasm as he continued bouncing. Kate finally managed to get him down and into his outfit. Back in their bedroom, William was being helped into his military uniform. The medals on his chest shined in the morning light. "How are they?" he asked when Kate returned. "George is nervous, Charlotte is excited, and Louis is, well, Louis," she said with a smile. William laughed. "So, a normal day then." A knock on the door announced breakfast. The family gathered in their private dining room to eat together before the busy day began. The table was set with their favorite foods to help calm their nerves. "Remember," William said to the children as they ate, "today is special, but we're still just us. Be yourselves." "But Daddy," Charlotte said seriously, "we have to be extra good today. The whole world is watching." "Yes, but the whole world will love you just as you are," Kate said. As they finished breakfast, the palace staff brought in their final outfits. Kate's elegant gown was carefully carried in by 2 assistants. The diamonds in her tiara caught the light as she put it on. William stood behind her as she looked in the mirror. "You look beautiful," he said. "And you look very handsome," she replied, straightening his medals. The children were brought in, now fully dressed in their formal outfits. George in his small version of his father's uniform, Charlotte in her cream dress with a matching headband, and Louis in his navy blue outfit. "Look at us," William said proudly. "The future of the monarchy." A palace aide knocked on the door. "Your Royal Highnesses, the cars are ready." William took a deep breath and looked at his family. "Let's make history today." As they walked down the grand staircase of Kensington Palace, photographers captured the moment. The children walked between their parents, heads held high despite their nerves. Outside, the fancy cars with the royal symbols waited. The family got in, waving to the staff who lined up to see them off. As the cars pulled away from the palace, Kate reached for William's hand. "Ready?" she asked. "As ready as we'll ever be," he replied with a smile that hid his own nervousness. The royal journey to the coronation had begun. The royal cars moved slowly through the streets of London. People lined both sides of the road, waving flags and cheering. Some had camped out all night just to see the royal family for a few seconds. Inside the first car, William looked out at the crowds. "Look at all these people," he said. Kate smiled and nodded. They'd been waiting for hours in the cold. The children pressed their faces against the windows. Louis waved excitedly, even though he had been told to wait until they were in the open carriages. "There are so many flags," Charlotte said, pointing at the red, white, and blue colors that filled the streets. George sat up straight, trying to be mature. "Dad, will we have to wave the whole time?" he asked. "Just remember to smile and wave every now and then," William told him. "And it's okay if your arm gets tired." As they got closer to Westminster Abbey, the crowds grew even bigger. Police officers stood at every corner, and soldiers lined the route in their bright red uniforms and tall black hats. "Look, Louis, soldiers," Charlotte pointed out to her little brother. Louis clapped his hands. "Just like in my book," he said. The cars slowed down as they approached the Abbey. Through the windows, they could see other royal guests arriving. Kings and queens, princes and princesses from other countries stepped out of their cars in their finest clothes. "There's Uncle Harry," George said suddenly, spotting his uncle among the guests. William and Kate exchanged quick glances, but kept smiling. "Yes, everyone is here today," Kate said simply. The car came to a stop. Outside, hundreds of cameras were pointed at them, ready to capture every moment. William took a deep breath. "Remember, just be yourselves," he said to the children, "and stay close to us." A royal aide opened the car door. The noise hit them immediately. Cheers, camera clicks, and reporters calling out. William stepped out first, then turned to help Kate. The children followed, blinking in the bright light of camera flashes. Charlotte held onto her mother's hand tightly. George walked beside his father, trying to copy his confident walk. Louis, excited by all the noise, jumped up and down until Kate gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Wave to the people, Louis," she whispered. Louis gave an enthusiastic wave with both hands, making the crowd cheer even louder. The family walked slowly up the steps of Westminster Abbey. The ancient building stood tall and grand against the blue sky. Its stone walls had seen hundreds of years of royal history, and today would add another chapter. Inside the Abbey, the noise from outside faded. The family was met by church officials in long robes. The children's eyes grew wide as they looked up at the high ceilings and colored glass windows. "It's like a castle in here," Louis whispered loudly. "Shay," Charlotte said, trying to be proper. "We're in a church." William and Kate smiled at each other. Even in such a formal setting, their children were still just children. They were led down the long center aisle. Guests stood on both sides, bowing their heads as the family passed. George looked straight ahead. Charlotte kept her eyes on her mother, and Louis couldn't help but look at everything and everyone. "So many people," he whispered. The family took their seats near the front of the Abbey. From here, they would have a perfect view of the ceremony. Kate helped arrange the children, making sure their clothes looked neat after the car ride. William leaned over to George. "Today you're watching history happen," he said quietly. "Someday this will be your father, and then, far in the future, it will be you." George nodded seriously. Even at his young age, he understood what his father meant. The grand organ began to play, filling the ancient abbey with music. The guests fell silent. Kate straightened Louis's collar one last time and took his hand to keep him still. "It's starting," she whispered. The big wooden doors at the back of the abbey opened. Everyone stood up. The king's procession was about to begin. Charlotte tugged on her mother's dress. "Money, when do we bow?" she asked. "I'll show you when it's time," Kate promised. As the procession started moving down the aisle, William felt a mix of pride and emotion. This was his father's moment, but it also meant they were one step closer to the day when these duties would fall to him. The children watched in wonder as the crown jewels were carried past them on velvet cushions. The gold and diamonds sparkled in the light from the windows. "Look how shiny," Louis said, a bit too loudly. Several guests smiled at his innocent excitement. Even on this most formal of days, a child's wonder brought joy to the serious occasion. The coronation ceremony continued as the king walked slowly down the long aisle. He wore a heavy red robe with white fur trim. Behind him, helpers carried the long train of his robe so it wouldn't drag on the floor. William felt his heart beat faster as his father passed by their row. This was no longer just the father who had read him bedtime stories or taught him to fish. Today, he was becoming the King of England in front of the whole world. Kate noticed William's tight jaw and gently touched his hand. She knew this day was hard for him in many ways. It meant his father had a new job, but it also meant William was now one step closer to being king himself someday. Grandpa looked so serious, Charlotte whispered to her mother. Yes, it's a serious day, Kate whispered back, but I bet he's smiling inside. The music grew louder as the king reached the front of the abbey. He turned and stood before the golden throne. The abbey fell completely silent. Louis, who had been good so far, started to swing his legs under his seat. Kate put a gentle hand on his knee to remind him to sit still. How much longer? He whispered, a bit too loudly. An old lady in a big hat turned to look at them. William gave her an apologetic smile. A while longer, Kate whispered to Louis. Would you like to hold my special handkerchief to keep your hands busy? Louis nodded, happy to have something to do. He carefully folded and unfolded the lace handkerchief while the ceremony went on. The archbishop, dressed in golden robes, began to speak in a deep voice that echoed through the abbey. He talked about duty and service to the country. George listened carefully, knowing these words would be important for him too someday. Then came the most important part. The king sat on the throne, and the archbishop lifted the heavy, golden crown high for everyone to see. The jewels in it sparkled like stars. It's time, Kate whispered to the children. The crown was slowly lowered onto the king's head. At that exact moment, everyone in the abbey stood up. God save the king, they all said together. The sound was so powerful that Louis covered his ears. Charlotte stood very straight, just like her mother. George watched his grandfather become king and thought about how one day, far in the future, he would sit on that same throne. William's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them away quickly. He thought of his grandmother, the queen, who had worn that crown for so many years. He thought of his mother, who never got to see this day. And he thought of his father, who had waited so long for this moment. Outside the abbey, big cannons fired to tell the whole city that England had a new king. The boom was so loud that even inside, the floors seemed to shake. Was that thunder? Louis asked, his eyes wide. No, those are cannons, William explained. They're saying hello to the new king. Louis thought about this for a moment. Can they say hello more quietly next time? William had to cover his mouth to hide his smile. Even at such a serious moment, his youngest son could make him laugh. The ceremony continued with more prayers and songs. The children tried their best to stay still, but it wasn't easy. Charlotte kept her back perfectly straight. George followed every part of the ceremony with serious eyes. Louis fidgeted with the handkerchief, making it into different shapes. Kate leaned close to William. They're doing so well, she whispered. William nodded proudly. Better than I did at their age. After what seemed like a very long time to the children, the king stood up from the throne. Now wearing the crown and holding a golden scepter, he walked back down the aisle. This time, everyone bowed their heads as he passed. Charlotte dipped into a perfect little curtsy, just as Kate had taught her. George bowed from the waist like his father. Louis tried to copy them, but nearly fell over, making several guests smile behind their hands. As the king passed their row, he gave his family the smallest nod and the hint of a smile. It was a private moment in the middle of this very public day. He looked at us, Louis said excitedly. Che, Charlotte reminded him. We're still in church. When the king had left the abbey, the other guests began to follow. Now came the part the children had been looking forward to, the carriage ride back to the palace. Outside Westminster Abbey, the sun shone brightly. After sitting still for so long in the dark church, the children blinked in the sudden light. The noise hit them all at once. Cheering crowds, music playing, and horses stomping their feet as they waited with the royal carriages. "Look at the horses," Louis shouted, pointing at the beautiful white horses with their red and gold decorations. People in the crowd heard him and laughed. They waved flags and called out to the royal family. Some held up signs that said, "God save the king," or "We love you, Charlotte." Charlotte noticed one of the signs with her name. She gave a small wave in that direction, and the people there cheered even louder. "Well done," Kate said quietly to her daughter. "That was very kind of you." William guided his family toward their carriage. It was open-topped so people could see them, painted gold with red velvet seats inside. Footmen in red uniforms stood ready to help them. "Remember how we practiced getting in," Kate reminded the children. The high step into the carriage could be tricky, especially for Louis with his short legs. George went first, climbing in carefully just as he had been taught. Charlotte followed, holding her dress so she wouldn't trip. When it was Louis's turn, a footman had to give him a little boost. The crowd loved this and clapped happily. William and Kate joined their children, and the family arranged themselves on the seats. William and Kate sat facing forward, with George beside his father, and Charlotte, and Louis next to their mother. "Wave like this," Kate showed Louis again, demonstrating the royal wave. A gentle movement of the hand from side to side. Not too fast, just nice and steady. Louis tried to copy her, but his wave was much more energetic. People along the route laughed and waved back just as excitedly. With a jerk, the carriage began to move. The horses stepped high, their feathered plumes bobbing with each step. Behind them came other carriages with more royal family members. "This is the best part," Charlotte said, her eyes shining. The carriage followed a route lined with thousands of people. Some had been waiting since dawn for this moment. They took pictures and videos with their phones as the royal family passed by. George waved steadily, just like his father. His back was straight, and he looked every bit the future king. Charlotte alternated between her perfect royal wave and pointing out interesting things she saw in the crowd. "Look, Mummy, that lady has a hat that looks just like a cake," she said. Kate followed her gaze and saw a woman wearing an enormous hat decorated with fabric flowers and ribbons. She smiled and gave the woman a special wave. Louis couldn't sit still. He bounced on the seat, waved with both hands, and sometimes stood up to get a better view until Kate gently pulled him back down. "So many people," he kept saying. "Hello, people." As they passed Trafalgar Square, the crowd was so thick that it looked like a sea of faces and flags. The noise was tremendous. Even the horses seemed impressed, tossing their heads at the sound. William leaned over to speak to George. "When I was your age, I rode in a carriage just like this. I was scared at first because of all the noise." "Were you really scared?" George asked, surprised that his confident father had ever been afraid. William nodded. "Yes, but then I remembered what my mother told me, that all these people were here because they cared about our family and our country." George thought about this as he looked at the happy faces. "They're not scary at all," he decided. The carriage turned a corner, and suddenly they could see Buckingham Palace ahead. Its gray stone walls and many windows looked grand against the blue sky. The famous balcony where the royal family would soon stand was decorated with red, white, and blue flowers. "We're almost home," Louis said, clapping his hands. Kate smiled at his words. The palace wasn't their everyday home, but today it felt like the center of their world. As they approached the palace gates, the horses slowed down. Soldiers in bright red uniforms and tall black bearskin hats stood at attention, saluting as the carriage passed. Louis tried to salute back, making William laugh. "Not yet, buddy," he said. "You can salute when you're older." The carriage rolled through the palace gates and into the courtyard, away from the public's eyes. For a moment, the family had privacy again. "You all did wonderfully," Kate said to the children. "I'm so proud of you." "Even me?" Louis asked. "I waved too much." "Especially you," William said, ruffling his youngest son's hair. You made everyone smile today. Inside Buckingham Palace, everything was busy. Workers rushed around, carrying trays of food and drinks. The halls were filled with important people from all over the world: kings, queens, presidents, and prime ministers. A palace helper led William, Kate, and the children to a quiet room where they could rest for a short time before the next part of the day. 10 minutes to freshen up, the helper said, closing the door behind them. Kate sighed with relief as she sat down. Her feet hurt from standing in high heels for so long. William loosened his collar a bit and stretched his shoulders. Can I take off my shoes? Louis asked, already pulling at his laces. Just for a few minutes, Kate said. She helped Charlotte fix her hair, which had gotten a bit messy during the carriage ride. George walked to the window and looked out. He could see the huge crowds still filling the streets around the palace. There are so many people out there, he said, more than at a football game. William joined him at the window. Much more. This is probably the biggest crowd London has seen in years. A knock on the door interrupted them. A palace worker came in with a tray of drinks and small sandwiches. Thought the young royals might be hungry. Your Royal Highnesses, she said with a kind smile. Thank you, Kate said. That's very thoughtful. The children ate quickly. They hadn't had food since early morning, and the ceremony had been very long. Louis had cucumber sandwich crumbs on his shirt, which Kate brushed away. What happens next? Charlotte asked, sipping her juice carefully so as not to spill on her dress. Now comes the official photos, William explained. Then the balcony appearance. And then the planes. Louis shouted excitedly. The fast planes will fly over. William laughed. Yes, the Royal Air Force will do a flyover. But remember, the planes are very loud, so be ready to cover your ears. Another knock came at the door. Your Royal Highnesses, they're ready for the photos in the throne room. The family quickly got ready. Louis put his shoes back on with help from Kate. William straightened his uniform. Then they followed the palace worker down long hallways with red carpets and paintings of kings and queens from long ago. Look, George, William said, pointing to one painting. That's your great-great-great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. George looked up at the serious-faced woman in the painting. Did she have to sit still for photos too? He asked. Even longer, William said. Back then, paintings took weeks to finish. They entered the throne room, a huge room with gold decorations on the walls and ceiling. The king and queen were already there, talking with some official photographers. When the king saw his grandchildren, his serious face broke into a warm smile. He bent down slightly, forgetting for a moment all the important people watching. And how did my brave grandchildren find the ceremony? He asked them. It was very long, Grandpa, Louis said honestly. The adults tried not to laugh. The king patted Louis on the head. It certainly was, my boy, even for me. The queen complimented Charlotte on her perfect curtsy in the abbey. Charlotte beamed with pride. I practiced for weeks, she said. The official photographer clapped his hands. If we could begin with the formal shots, he said. The king and queen seated, with the prince and princess of Wales standing behind, and the children in front. Everyone moved to their places. The children stood where they were told, trying their best to stand still. Chins up, shoulders back, the photographer called. And smile. The camera flashed again and again. First, the whole family, then just the king with William, then the queen with Kate and Charlotte. Every possible combination was photographed. After many pictures, Louis began to fidget. Are we done yet? He whispered to his mother. Almost, Kate whispered back. Just a few more. The photographer wanted one last picture. Just the three children with their grandfather, the new king. As they posed, the king said something quietly that made all three children laugh at the same time. The photographer caught that moment. A picture of joy between a grandfather and his grandchildren, not just a king and his heirs. Finally, the photography session was over. A palace worker came in with an update. "The crowds are ready, Your Majesty. The balcony appearance is scheduled for 5 minutes from now." The children's eyes lit up. This was the part they had been waiting for. Standing on the famous balcony of Buckingham Palace, looking out over the massive crowds and seeing the planes fly overhead. "Ready for your big moment?" William asked the children. They nodded eagerly. Even George, who is usually quiet, looked excited. As they walked toward the balcony doors, Kate straightened Louis's collar one last time. The royal family gathered behind the tall glass doors that led to the famous Buckingham Palace balcony. Through the glass, they could see the huge crowd that filled the mall, the wide road that leads to the palace. The people looked like tiny dots from so far away, but their cheers could be heard even through the thick walls. A palace worker checked his watch. 2 minutes, Your Majesty," he said to the king. Louis tugged on his father's sleeve. "Will they open the doors soon?" he asked. "I want to see everything." William smiled down at his youngest son. "Very soon, and remember what we practiced about waving." Louis nodded seriously, then showed his father his royal wave. It was much better than earlier, slower and more controlled. "Perfect," William said. "You're a natural." Charlotte stood very straight beside her mother. She had been looking forward to this moment for weeks. In her bedroom at home, she had practiced standing and waving in front of her mirror, pretending she was on the balcony. "Money," she whispered to Kate. "How many people are out there?" "Thousands," Kate said. "Maybe even 1 million people across London today." Charlotte's eyes grew wide. "1 million people will see me." Kate nodded. "And millions more on television around the world." Instead of being scared by this thought, Charlotte stood even taller. She was ready for her moment in history. George, meanwhile, stayed close to his grandfather. The new king put his hand on George's shoulder. "One day," the king said quietly, "you will stand here as king yourself. But that won't be for a very long time." George looked up at his grandfather. "I'm not in a hurry," he said, making the king laugh. "Good answer," the king replied. "Neither was I." The palace worker stepped forward again. "It's time, Your Majesty." 2 other workers moved to the glass doors. Slowly and with great ceremony, they pulled the doors open. Bright sunlight flooded in, along with the full sound of the crowd's cheers. The noise was like thunder. The king and queen stepped out first. The cheers grew even louder when the people saw their new king wearing his crown. William and Kate followed, with the children between them. Louis's mouth fell open when he saw the size of the crowd. People filled every space as far as he could see. Flags waved like a colorful sea. Signs and banners were held high. "Wow," he whispered. The family lined up along the balcony edge. The king and queen in the center, with William, Kate, and the children to their right, and other royal family members to their left. George remembered his training and stood with his hands clasped behind his back, just like his father. Charlotte began her perfect royal wave. Louis, caught up in the excitement, waved with both hands at first, until Kate gently corrected him. Cameras clicked below as hundreds of photographers captured every moment. Television cameras zoomed in on the children's faces. Around the world, people watching on TV smiled at the sight of the young royals on the balcony. The crowd began to chant, "God save the king! God save the king!" The king raised his hand to acknowledge them. Next to him, George watched carefully, studying how his grandfather handled this important moment. Kate bent down to speak to Louis. "Can you hear what they're saying?" she asked. Louis listened hard. "They're saying Grandpa's new name, King." Kate smiled. "That's right. They're celebrating him." Suddenly, Charlotte pointed to the sky. "Look, the planes are coming." In the distance, they could see small dots growing larger. The Royal Air Force planes were approaching in perfect formation. First came the helicopters, flying slow and steady in a neat line. "I can see the pilots," Louis shouted excitedly, jumping up and down. Next came larger transport planes, then fighter jets flying in a V-shape. The crowd cheered as each new group passed overhead. William lifted Louis up so he could see better. "The best is coming last," he told his son. As if on cue, the crowd gasped as the final group appeared. 9 jets in tight formation came speeding toward the palace. As they passed overhead, they left trails of red, white, and blue smoke, the colors of the Union Jack flag. The noise was tremendous. Louis covered his ears, but kept his eyes wide open, not wanting to miss anything. Charlotte clapped her hands in delight. Even serious George broke into a wide smile. The royal family waved as the planes disappeared into the distance. For a few more minutes, they stayed on the balcony, waving to the crowds below. The people didn't want them to leave, and the cheers continued. Finally, the king nodded to William. It was time to go back inside. The family gave one last wave to the crowd, then turned to walk back through the doors. That was amazing. Louis said as soon as they were inside, "Can we do it again tomorrow?" After the balcony appearance, the palace became busy again. Important guests arrived for a special lunch to celebrate the coronation. Kings, queens, presidents, and prime ministers from around the world gathered in the grand state dining room. For the royal children, however, it was time for a short break. A palace helper led them to a smaller room where they could rest and have some lunch of their own. "I'm starving," Louis announced as he flopped onto a soft chair. "Me too," Charlotte agreed. "Standing still makes you hungry." Kate smiled at her children. "You all did so well today. I'm very proud of you." A different helper brought in trays of food for the children. Simple sandwiches, fruit, and small cakes with tiny crowns made of sugar on top. "Look, crown cakes," Louis said, picking one up immediately. George ate his lunch quietly, still thinking about everything he had seen. After a while, he turned to his father, who was checking messages on his phone. "Dad, when Grandpa became king today, that made you the Prince of Wales, right?" William looked up, surprised by his son's question. "That's right. And that means one day, I'll be the Prince of Wales too." William nodded. "Yes, when I become king, you'll take my place as Prince of Wales." George thought about this as he ate his sandwich. "That's a big job, isn't it?" William put his phone away and sat next to his son. "It is. But you won't do it until you're much older. And you won't do it alone. You'll have help from many people." Kate watched this conversation with a gentle smile. Even at his young age, George was beginning to understand his future role. After lunch, the children had their faces washed and their clothes straightened. It was time to join the reception where they would meet guests from around the world. "Remember your manners," Kate reminded them as they walked down a long hallway. "And if you don't understand what someone says, just smile and say thank you." The reception was held in the largest room of the palace. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and paintings of past kings and queens covered the walls. Hundreds of people stood in small groups, talking and laughing. When the royal children entered with their parents, many people turned to look at them. Some smiled and waved. Others bowed their heads respectfully. The king motioned for William and his family to join him. He was talking to a tall man with a colorful sash across his chest. "Ah, here they are," the king said. "May I present my son, the Prince of Wales, his wife Catherine, and my grandchildren." The tall man bowed to William and Kate. "Your Royal Highnesses, it is an honor." Then he bent down to speak to the children. "And you young princes and princess, you were so well behaved today. My own children would never sit still for so long." Charlotte gave a perfect little curtsy. "Thank you, sir," she said politely. George bowed his head just like his father had done. Louis tried to copy them, but ended up doing a sort of bouncy bow that made the tall man laugh. As the afternoon went on, the children met many important people. Some were kings and queens who wore their own crowns and medals. Others were presidents and prime ministers in dark suits and fancy dresses. A queen from a northern country bent down to speak to Charlotte. "What a lovely dress you're wearing, Princess Charlotte. she said with a kind smile. "Thank you, Your Majesty," Charlotte replied, remembering the proper way to speak to a queen. "I like your crown very much." The queen laughed softly. "Perhaps you will wear one yourself someday." George stood by his father, watching how William greeted each person. He tried to copy his father's handshake when he was introduced to people. Louis, meanwhile, was getting tired. The day had been very long for a 5-year-old boy. He stayed close to Kate, sometimes hiding behind her dress when too many people wanted to talk to him. Kate noticed his tiredness. "Not much longer," she whispered to him. "You're doing very well." A famous football player was among the guests. When he met the children, Louis suddenly became excited again. "I've seen you on TV," Louis said. "You can kick the ball really high." The football player laughed. "That's right. Would you like to play football sometime?" Louis nodded eagerly. "Yes, can we play now?" The adults laughed, but the football player knelt down to Louis's level. "Not today, Your Royal Highness, but I promise to have a game with you someday." As the reception continued, palace workers moved among the guests with trays of drinks and small foods. The children were allowed to have special juice, served in fancy glasses that made them feel very grown-up. Charlotte sipped her juice carefully, trying not to spill. She watched the ladies in their beautiful dresses and jewels, especially noticing the way they held their glasses and how they laughed politely at jokes. As evening began to fall, the grand coronation reception started to wind down. Many guests had already left to attend other parties across London. The children were showing clear signs of tiredness after their long, exciting day. Louis had found a comfortable chair in a corner and was sitting quietly, his eyes half closed. Charlotte was still talking to guests, but her perfect posture had begun to droop a little. Even George, who had been so careful to behave like a future king all day, was stifling yawns. William caught Kate's eye across the room and gave a small nod. It was time to take the children home. They had done their royal duty beautifully, but they were still young children who needed rest. Kate went to Louis first, gently touching his shoulder. "Time to go home, sweetheart," she said softly. Louis looked up with sleepy eyes. "Is it all over now?" "The official parts are over," Kate told him. "Grandpa and Grandma will stay for the evening events, but we can go home." Louis stood up and took his mother's hand. "Good. My feet hurt from all the standing." Kate smiled. "Mine too." William gathered George and Charlotte from their conversations with guests. He made polite excuses to the people they were talking with. "The young royals have had a very long day," he explained to an ambassador who seemed disappointed that Charlotte was leaving. "Of course, Your Royal Highness," the ambassador said with understanding. "They have been remarkable throughout the day." The family made their way across the room to say goodbye to the king and queen. Many guests smiled as they passed, some bowing their heads respectfully. The king was sitting in a gilded chair, still wearing his crown though he had removed some of the heavier robes. He looked tired too, but his face brightened when he saw his grandchildren approach. "Ah, leaving us already?" he asked with a warm smile. William nodded. "I think the little ones have reached their limit, Father." "As have I, nearly," the king admitted. He leaned forward to speak to his grandchildren. "You have made me very proud today. I couldn't have asked for better behavior from my grandchildren." "Even when I waved too much?" Louis asked. The king laughed and touched Louis's cheek gently. "Especially then. The people loved it." Charlotte stepped forward and gave a perfect final curtsy of the day. "It was a beautiful coronation, Grandpa," she said seriously. "Thank you, my dear. Much of that beauty came from having you all there." George, always more reserved, simply bowed his head. "Congratulations on becoming king, Grandpa," he said formally. The king's eyes shone with emotion as he looked at his eldest grandson. He reached out and put his hand on George's shoulder. No words were needed between them. Both understood the path that lay ahead. The queen kissed each child goodbye. "Get some good rest," she told them. "Tomorrow the whole country will be talking about how wonderfully you all did." The royal family made their way out through a side entrance of the palace, away from the remaining crowds and cameras. Their cars were waiting, with police officers standing guard. As they stepped outside, they noticed the sky had turned a beautiful shade of pink and orange. The sun was setting on this historic day. "Look at the sky," Charlotte said, pointing up. "It's the same colors as the smoke from the planes. It's like the sky is celebrating too," Kate said, putting her arm around Charlotte's shoulders. The family got into their cars. As they drove away from Buckingham Palace, they could still hear music and cheering from the crowds who remained outside, celebrating long into the evening. Inside the quiet car, the children began to relax. Louis leaned against his mother, his eyes growing heavier by the minute. "Was I a good prince today?" he asked sleepily. Kate kissed the top of his head. "The very best prince." George was looking out the window, watching London pass by. The streets were filled with people celebrating. Flags hung from buildings, and some streets had been closed for big parties. "Everyone is so happy," he observed. William nodded. "Coronation days are special. The last one was before I was born. Most people never see one in their lifetime. But we'll see another one," George said thoughtfully, "when you become king." William was quiet for a moment, thinking about his son's words. "Yes," he finally said, "but not for a very long time, I hope." Charlotte had been listening to their conversation. "And then another one when George becomes king," she added. "And I'll be a grown-up lady then." "A very important lady," Kate told her. "A princess who helps her brother the king." Charlotte liked this idea. She sat up straighter again, already imagining her grown-up self. As their cars turned into the private road leading to their home, Louis had fallen fast asleep against Kate's side. Charlotte's eyes were also growing heavy. Even George looked ready for bed. "Almost home," William said quietly. Kate looked at her children. These three young royals who had shown such poise and character today. Despite the tiaras and uniforms, the ceremony and tradition, they were still her children. Today they had walked the line between royal duty and childhood beautifully. "They did so well," she whispered to William. He reached across and squeezed her hand. "They made history today," he said, "and they didn't even realize it." The cars pulled up to the family's home. The lights inside were already on, giving the house a warm and welcoming glow. After the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, their own home looked wonderfully normal and cozy. William carried the sleeping Louis from the car, while Kate helped Charlotte, who was stumbling sleepily. George walked beside them, tired but still alert enough to walk on his own. "Home at last," William said quietly as they entered through the front door. The house staff greeted them with warm smiles, but kept quiet, seeing how tired the children were. The family's dogs came running, tails wagging happily, but even they seemed to understand that tonight was not a time for their usual excited jumping. "Let's get everyone ready for bed," Kate said. "It's been the longest day." Upstairs, nannies were waiting to help the children change out of their formal clothes. Louis didn't even wake up as he was gently changed into his pajamas and tucked into bed. William placed his son's small shoes neatly beside his bed, thinking about how those little feet had stood so bravely through the long ceremony. In Charlotte's room, Kate helped her out of her beautiful dress. The young princess was fighting to keep her eyes open. "Can I keep my dress forever?" Charlotte asked sleepily as Kate hung it carefully in the wardrobe. "Of course," Kate promised. "It's part of history now." Charlotte smiled as she climbed into bed. "I liked being part of history," she murmured as she snuggled under her covers. Kate tucked her in and kissed her forehead. "You were wonderful. Sweet dreams, my brave girl." In George's room, William helped his son change out of his formal outfit. "You know," William said as he folded George's small jacket, "when I was your age, I found days like this very hard. All the people watching, having to be perfect all the time." George nodded. "It is hard sometimes," he admitted. "But I kept thinking about what you told me, that people were watching because they care about us. William felt a surge of pride and put his hand on his son's shoulder. "You're going to be a good king someday, George." George climbed into bed. "Not for a long, long time," he said, echoing his father's earlier words. "That's right," William agreed. "First, you get to be a boy." After the children were all in bed, William and Kate changed out of their own formal clothes. Kate sighed with relief as she took off her tiara and high-heeled shoes. William removed his medals and heavy uniform jacket. "Tea?" he asked. Kate nodded gratefully. "Please, and maybe something to eat that doesn't require perfect table manners." They went downstairs to the kitchen, which felt wonderfully ordinary after the grand rooms of the palace. A staff member had left a pot of tea and some sandwiches for them, then discreetly disappeared to give them privacy. William poured the tea while Kate turned on the television. Every channel was showing highlights from the Coronation Day. There they were, their family, waving from the balcony, riding in carriages, standing in Westminster Abbey. "Look at Louis's face when the planes flew over," Kate said, smiling at the screen where their youngest son's expression of pure joy was captured forever. They watched themselves on the screen, seeing the day through the eyes of the cameras. The commentators were praising how well the children had behaved, how poised Charlotte had been, how serious George had looked, how charming Louis's enthusiasm had been. "They're already calling it the children's coronation," William noted as one news presenter used the phrase. "They stole the show," Kate agreed. She took a bite of sandwich, enjoying the simple food after a day of fancy canapes and formal dining. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking tea and watching the coverage. Outside, they could hear fireworks in the distance as the nation continued to celebrate. "Do you think they'll remember this day when they're older?" Kate asked. William thought for a moment. "George will, certainly. Charlotte probably. Louis," he smiled. "Louis might just remember the planes and the carriage ride." "We'll have the pictures to show them," Kate said. "And the recordings. And probably books about it too." William nodded, then raised his teacup. "To our children," he said, "royal when they needed to be, but still wonderfully themselves." Kate clinked her cup against his. "And to us, for surviving another historic day." They laughed softly, not wanting to wake the sleeping children upstairs. Later, before they went to bed themselves, William and Kate peeked into each child's room. Louis was sprawled across his bed, one arm flung out, sleeping deeply. Charlotte was curled up neatly, her favorite toy held close. George was sleeping on his side, his face peaceful in the soft glow of his nightlight. These royal children, who had stood before the world with such poise today, now looked simply like any other sleeping children, sweet, innocent, and safe in their dreams. "They belong to the nation," William whispered as they closed George's door. "But in moments like this, they're just ours." Kate took his hand as they walked to their own bedroom. "The perfect balance," she said. Outside their window, the last of the fireworks lit up the night sky, marking the end of this historic day. Tomorrow would bring newspapers full of pictures and stories about the coronation. But for now, the royal family rested, their public duty done with grace, and their private bonds stronger than ever.